This is An Infinite Path, spoken word essays by Niles Heckman, some of which go on to become our documentary short subject films, half of which release freely here through the podcast, all of which can be found through your support at nilesheckman.com. At the time of this writing, much of the world is under global social distancing advocation, physically separated in order to counter an infection curve of a said-to-be global virus which has a supposed incubation time, meaning time where you don't show symptoms but can still infect whole rooms of other critters, of as much as 2 weeks. So at this odd time-space vector, we are going to share some insights on loneliness and social connection. But before that, while you may be at home, my colleague Rak Razam and I are honoring our much earlier goal of releasing the second episode of our documentary series, Shamans of the Global Village, Episode 2, Jose Luis Ramirez and the Peyote Cactus, in the first quarter of 2020. So that is out now and available for your viewing at shamansoftheglobalvillage.com. We are very proud of the episode, especially for scrounging it together on just a few $1,000 budget and shooting it in 3 days. It's a must-watch, and here's a note from my colleague regarding.
By the way, dude, our documentary fucking rocks. I can't believe all those early ambient, they're not doing anything for 30 minutes of the whole documentary. The narration carries it, the whole thing pieces together, it builds to a crescendo. The saturation of colors, apart from at the start with my bad hair shot, are incredible. The filmmaking is so beautiful. We should be winning awards, dude. This is I can't believe we pulled this out of nothing, out of $3,000 and sleeping on the dirt. We're fucking awesome. I just want you to remember that. I love you. Aloha.
So do check it out, either with someone else or alone. And perhaps alone and somewhat physically isolated? Well, you are not alone. Your being here is a very special thing, and you are loved for it. Perhaps just from afar at the moment. Notice how Rak said in his message upon me sending him the final audio mixed cut, I love you. One of the numerous definitions of love are benevolence, goodwill, or endearment, the deepest form of affection towards another. Feeling unloved and alone for prolonged times is one of the worst tortures any creature can experience. All zoos, even nicer ones, are generally terrible places where animals live their lives in pathetically small enclosures. We also see this dynamic of trying to monetize majestic creatures at animal water parks. Look at a satellite view of dreadful SeaWorld and check out how big the parking lot is and how small the pool is that a single isolated orca whale lives in. Shows where their priorities are and exemplifies that the only acceptable place for a wild animal to be living outside the wild is in an animal reserve or sanctuary. There have been numerous sad cases of staggeringly lonely elephants living in captivity. Flavia, an Asian elephant, lived in a Cordoba zoo in southern Spain, where she first arrived at the age of 3. Since the day she arrived, the horrendous cruelty to Flavia was that she never saw another elephant. Elephants are incredibly social in the wild, and females often stay with their mothers for life. Being forced to live alone, Flavia suffered from depression for years, and displayed the signature signs of captive distress, including swaying and pacing. Another elephant, Molly, has not felt grass under her feet or had contact with another elephant for nearly 40 years. The trees around her walls are out of reach. She was snatched away from her mother in Sri Lanka at a very young age and sent to the Philippines as a heartless gift for then-President Ferdinand Marcos in 1977. Spending most of her waking hours leaning against concrete walls in an attempt to ease her excruciatingly painful foot problems. Her only respite from the monotony of her confinement is picking up peanuts thrown onto her small enclosure by visitors. Campaigners for her release say her stark surroundings in the Manila Zoo have left her chronically depressed and suffering from a host of potentially life-threatening ailments. Duh! Worst of all, Hanako, often called the world's loneliest elephant, lived alone for 60 years in a barren concrete prison at Inakashira Park in Tokyo beginning in 1954. Over the decades of her being a prisoner, the consciousness of the general populace raised enough to put enough social pressure on the zoo to force her to be transferred to a reserve. But at that point, due to her age, she was too old to move. Her legs were also shot from standing on concrete all those years, so instead she was euthanized. The point is, elephants and whales are amazingly complex, highly intelligent, exceptionally social animals who have families and friends and who grieve their dead. Just like Homo sapiens. Even the most independent and introspective humans need social connection, both mentally, physically, and spiritually for camaraderie and guidance. Sure, there are masses of non-player-like, two-legged, fleshy meat suit bots who are bland, boring, and uninteresting, and one could only spend an hour tops with them per year before wanting to start pulling their hair out. Yet there are many others out there who are not that. They are excellent and at your similar vibratory level or even above. Relationships and friendships are work. Keeping them up requires effort. Of course, there are numerous life phases when we tend to somewhat naturally lose contact with people we may have liked in the past and become isolated from. When young sprouts distribute to other towns and cities to go to college for pre-work training and work-related networking, where the money you spend to the higher-level schooling institution is purely about your connections made. Whether it's the local junior college whose students' parents will be the lower to upper middle class, or Oxford or Harvard Business School whose students' parents will almost surely be affluent. You are paying not to learn, but to be exposed to those networks of connections for future career potential. The next common one is when folks get married and oftentimes become way too off balance, involved only with their spouses, and not an outer social pre-existing group of a friendship social circle. Or another major one is when folks have children and go super bonkers off balance, putting 100% of their time solely into working and raising those kids, and then suddenly a few years later realizing they have no good gal pals or guy buddies because their phone has just become a rarely or seldom used app on their phone. If you've lost contact with friends from the past, which you kind of wish you hadn't, likely because many people have the, hey, they haven't contacted me in a while, it's their turn to put forth the effort attitude, that's understandable, but it's also your own doings. There was a gal who lived in New York City who was very advanced spiritually in many ways. She had a trust fund so she didn't have to work and basically spent all of her time working on herself. Good for her. But one of her biggest blockings to her own progress, if not her very biggest, was she was rubbish at social protocols. Finding fault, blame, and imperfection in others, and using that as a magnifying glass to make micro-excuses to not like virtually anyone else, which was a way, of course, refusing to see those things as a problem within herself. After spending a day with her, you'd really just want to get away from her. This basic thing for many, having some friends, was a huge difficulty for her, and she's the only one who could realize she needed to work on that aspect of her personality and then adjust that within herself. For we are not desolated and isolated islands. We are a series of millions of interconnected lush islands. There was a dude who left Los Angeles because he didn't have a single friend who would drive him to the airport. Instead, it was all work acquaintances for him and maybe some light fair-weather friends, but no real friendship or camaraderie. So more effort was needed within him to find others, perhaps in another city entirely, which he ended up doing, who he would want to give a ride to the airport. Then those excellent friends he would make might want to then reciprocate the same thing by being willing to get up at 4 a.m. to get in a freezing cold car to pick him up at his place and give him a ride to make a flight. Loneliness is a product of failing to put forth the outer effort to deeper social connection. The 30-some-year-old neighbor gal next to where I used to live is very sweet. But in the 5+ years of me living there, I never once saw a single other person over at her house except her parents. Basically, it was very obvious that she had little to no friends. She just has animals, which are her 4-legged children, but I could still sense the loneliness from the other side of the fence. Health and safety are paramount, but is that just physical health? What about mental health? If we are confined and cooped up for weeks or even months, mental health starts to decline. The only way one can counter that is by having a healthy environment with healthy social connections. That's why the mountain man, who's been living in the cabin by himself in rural Alaska for years, is doing numerous things right, but his personality inevitably transmutes into that of a nutter butter. When mankind, the social butterfly, is socially distanced from one another, either by their own will or by the request or requirement of some perceived authority, it reduces their mental health. Seeing packed beaches or public trails or parks be forced to close because they are so full of people off from work may help mitigate a contagion spread and help physical health in the short term, but declines mental health if they were to be inaccessible in the long term. Even though it could be argued as a technocratic takeover, using modern technologies such as your phone, email, or even better, video chat conferencing software to reach out to others is a beautiful thing during times of physical isolation. The internet is no substitution for physical meetup, but it's also a tool we're lucky to have for building online community. Where if you felt a bit lonely or blue, having a great remote conversation with a friend can leave you feeling quickly as connected, colorized, and energized as if you were doing it around the campfire. Having had a podcast for numerous years, and also speaking occasionally on others' podcasts, has been my attempt to reduce some amount of culturally created barriers. And there is one barometer alone that tells me if it was a good chat, which is I feel better afterwards. Having guests on not to fill some bullshit weekly slot requirement by being on some rigid schedule with subscribers or patrons, but because I actually care about the person I'm taking the time to talk to, their work, and would want to have the conversation privately regardless. As a documentarian, an extra bonus is having them allow me to record them to document the conversation in order to then share, which then reciprocates even further connections with those who listen. All of nature is a seamless web of pheromonal mitigated connections and interactions. Elephants in parks living in harmony in their natural environment are vibrant and healthy, just like all spiritual beings. Higher level nature has always shown us this. The ultimate result of all divinities through time is union with the monad, the one, the white light void of unity consciousness. For those who are fortunate enough to get even a sliver of a glimpse of this experience, one paramount takeaway is Gnosis that all barriers are ultimately illusionary. So here's your initiatory question. How do you know that you are suffering? Your answer: if anyone else is suffering, I am suffering.